This is Mr. Schwieder for Chapter 2 of Social Studies 7. We're talking about the French and when they arrived in North America. So first we have to talk about imperialism. Imperialism is set up into two parts. There's a home country, or the mother country as it's sometimes known, and the colony. So the colony is like the colony is the country that's taken over by the home country. So Canada was a colony of France and then of England. So when you take all these colonies and you put them together, it makes up an empire. And that the act of controlling your empire is imperialism. Um, Having a lot of countries and having control over them, that's called imperialism. So when we talk about New France, we're going to talk about how they colonized and how imperialism kind of affected Canada. So in the 1400s, they were looking for a new way to get to Asia because the Silk Road was a land like a road from Asia all the way through. If you travel along the land, all the way through until it reached different parts in the Middle East as well as Eastern Europe, and that's how people in Western Europe would get a lot of their goods. They would have to trade through the east through the Silk Road. The Silk Road was very dangerous, though. It as people would ship on it, you could get bandits that would steal your stuff. You could get sick and die. If as you were crossing rivers, you could lose your shipment. So it was very risky, and it caused the prices for these things to be very high. So they were hoping that there was a faster way. So as you can see here, this is they would travel through the land on land. They would also go through water here, but they could never ever go that far from shore, because if they got far from shore, they would get lost. They didn't have the tools nor the sails to travel that far off land. Um, when they left France or Spain or England and they were looking for a new place, they believed that if they crossed the Atlantic Ocean, they would come out right here in China. So if they come out from China or India, they were looking for India, they could find these people, this shortcut. So that's what they were looking for. And that's why when they showed up, when the Europeans showed up, they knew they weren't Chinese because of the way they looked, but they were brown and they were different shades, which is what made them think that they were Indians. So that's why they were called Indians. Expanding across the ocean, there are four main reasons why countries would set up other um, would go and take over countries and look for these countries. The very first one is economics. Europeans set up colonies so that they could claim the resources of the land themselves. In Canada, we had a lot of wood, we had a lot of different things. In other countries, they would have metals. We had a ton of furs. In economics, it goes back to what you can sell back in your homeland for a large profit, as well as if it would help you for um, well, this is more in a competition, but it would help you build up your army. So the competition is they wanted every country in Europe was always trying to be the best country in Europe. The more colonies you had, the better it looked. The richer you were, the better it looked, and the richer you were is usually because you were importing those goods from other countries. So if you could import gold, that would be way better than wood. However, the gold would not help your army because a gold um, fort does not hold up very well, but a wood fort is very strong, especially if it's strong wood. So competition with each other is another reason why imperialism was taking off at the time. Economics first, competition second, religion was a big thing. They wanted to spread Christianity. They believed it was their duty to spread Christianity across the nation. There are people that still believe it is their duty to spread their religion around the world, but they believe that absolutely Christianity was right, and if you believed something else, you were going straight to hell. Now, it was a Christian's duty to go and save that person from hell by converting them. So that's what they ended up trying to do. And the final one was curiosity. It was um, right around the time of the Renaissance, and they really wanted to know what was going on, what was out there. They found a new land that eventually they figured out was not India, and they wanted to explore what was out there and get together and just figure that all out. When France starts to come to Canada in 1534. Now there's an Englishman that arrives in 1492, I believe. But he lands on the shores. He doesn't really make contact with the First Nations all that much. He doesn't really trade with them all that much. He basically takes Canadian fish, ships it back to Europe, and that's really what they've done. They didn't try to colonize Canada. They didn't um, use their furs. They didn't take their woods. They had no other interest besides the fur or the fish off their shores. So Cartier starts to explore Canada. So in 1534, he starts to explore Canada, and he met the Mi'kmaq over in Nova Scotia, and then he settled in Gaspé. Gaspé is here in Quebec. So you can see that's where Gaspé is. This is Quebec City over here. And later on, when we talk about Acadia, Acadia will be down here in the south of Nova Scotia. So he saw the Mi'kmaq over here in Nova Scotia and then sailed up and bumped into the Haudenosaunee, actually. So when he bumped into the Haudenosaunee, the leader was Donnacona. So Donnacona's two sons came back with Cartier back to France for, I believe, 3 years. And he brought the sons back to guarantee that there was people there, that there was a reason to return. So Cartier came back. Sorry, it was 1 year. They came back in one year later. When they came back 1 year later, um, in 1536, 2 years. Man, I'm all over the place. 2 years. Cartier forcibly took Donnacona and 9 other villages. He actually tricked them and said, "Let's go for a dinner on my ship." And when Donnacona stepped onto the ship, he sailed away with the Haudenosaunee leader. Um, so the Haudenosaunee, this was forever ruined. This would help ruin the relationship that the French would have with that First Nations tribe, really. Um, they the First Nations really helped them when they were there for the winter, because scurvy would come in. Scurvy is a disease that would make your teeth fall out and would give you the cold sores, and it would swell your tongue up, and it would make your tongue start to have those little bumps that really hurt. Um, and it would make your gums loosen up so that your teeth would actually start to wiggle and eventually fall out. This is from lack of vitamin C. This is why when your parents tell you to eat your fruit and eat your vegetables, this is what they're trying to prevent. They're trying to prevent your teeth from falling out of your head. They're trying to prevent this not cold sores, but open sores in your mouth and your tongue from swelling. And this can still happen today if you don't have enough vitamin C. It happened to my brother, which is a different story completely. Um, but the Haudenosaunee saved them. They boiled bark and they showed the French how to live through this time. These are it's a very important part of the relationship between the French and the First Nations, because it wasn't one way. It was the French needed the First Nations, and then the First Nations began to need the French because that's who they traded with. It was a very symbiotic relationship, which means both profited. So after Cartier, we come back and it talks about Pierre de Monts, which is the initial person, but more importantly, Samuel de Champlain. Now, Champlain set up he helped set up Acadia, which we talked about before, in the south of Nova Scotia, and which means an earthly paradise, as you can see right here. Um, there was trading going on, there was good farming. When they came back, they started to set up further inland. They started to set up inland because it was closer to the fur trade. So if you didn't have to wait for all the First Nations to move through here, I hope you can see my mouse, and you can move to Port Royal, and you don't have to all the furs up here when where the winter is cold, and because it gets colder, these furs are nice and thick and better than where it's warm down here and not as cold. Those furs are not as good as the north. So the further north you could get, the better it's going to be without freezing, obviously. And you needed access to water. So Quebec was far enough inland that they could get there with their boats, but and still be close enough to the First Nations that they could trade very easily with them, because the First Nations had to come to their forts before the Court de Bois were around. So that's why Samuel de Champlain, he started with Acadia, but he saw a better opportunity by starting the city of Quebec, or Fort Quebec, which was at the time. When you go back up, it talks about a monopoly. The French king granted a trade monopoly, which means mono, that only one person has that, or one business, one single entity has the rights to that area. So all of this, all of Canada right then, was guaranteed to only be traded to Pierre de Monts and Samuel de Champlain, that group of people. So it was quite nice actually. Um, Again, Samuel de Champlain needed the French, needed the First Nations, because the winter they had to show them how to live. To show them all the tricks and the hints. Living in France was very different than living in Canada. We have -40 for our winters. It doesn't really get to -40 over in France. We have very warm summers, which it got to over there, but they're so short and they're so quick that it's tougher to grow things compared to France. So they had to change a lot of the way they lived. To do this, Champlain had to befriend the Wandon, the Wandot, or the Huron. He did this by taking his guns and actually joining a raid against the Haudenosaunee, which eventually like sealed their hatred, the Haudenosaunee hatred of the French. First they stole Donnacona, um, and eventually, let him die over in France, and then they came back, and this Frenchman shot a gun, and three of their chiefs died with one shot because he put three bullets on them. So they were very intimidated by the guns, and the Wandot and the Haudenosaunee were arch enemies. So when Champlain came out and sided with the Wandot, or the Huron, they that sealed it for the Haudenosaunee, which would for the next 70 years fight against the French. Whenever there was a war, there was a fight. This next part brings us to the Court de Bois. And the Court de Bois were, especially Etienne Brulé, the Court de Bois were runners of the woods. So they were French, and they would trade deep within the First Nations territory. And because they would trade deep within there, they would sometimes live with the First Nations. They would get to know their language. They would get to know their way of life. The cultural exchange, where the exchange of culture, the exchange of French way of doing things compared to the First Nations way of doing things, was extremely high when these people lived there. Um, and they eventually started to have relations with them. The Cote de Bois and the First Nations would get together and have babies, and that's actually how the first Métis were born. The Métis were First Nations and European, is what they're known as. So the French did not like that idea, and those Métis were kind of shunned. They were looked at as The First Nations were looked at as secondary people, as savages, as not as equal. So when you had babies with a First Nation lady, that baby was then considered First Nation. So it was shunned from the French forts, and it was looked at as First Nations instead of French. The First Nations would look at those Métis a similar way and said, he's more French than he is First Nation, so why should we teach him our way? His father is French. He should go live with his father. That was the way it was. So that's the beginning of the Métis, which actually doesn't explode until later on. But the Métis are a big part of the fur trade. Um, In New France, with these Cours de Bois, because they explored so far, they started to explore down the Mississippi River, and they started to explore down into what is the west of France, basically, and they claimed a lot of the west of America for France, because that was what you did back then. When you see it, you claimed it for the European country, even though there's a lot of First Nations people down there. After a while, after about um, I think, yeah, there you go. In 1663, King Louis the 13th, sorry, started to get frustrated with the way that um, France was growing and wanted it to grow much, much faster. So he started to take over, and he set up the Sovereign Council. And the Sovereign Council was made up of the governor, the intendant, the bishop, as well as um, oh, I forget, the seigneurs as well. Um, the governor was the head and would represent the king in um, in New France. The intendant would be in charge of day-to-day affairs, and the bishop is in charge of the church in New France. So these people would be replaced if they weren't doing a good enough job of running the country and representing them well in New France. The seigneurs are a tricky part, but where they're in charge of the land. So they would split up the land and give a chunk of land to a seigneur, and that seigneur was responsible in for recruiting farmers and recruiting people to come to Canada and start to live in, I guess, New France or Canada. So in New France, these farmers would come over, and they would encourage um, women to come over. They were encouraged. Um, Not a lot of women wanted to live here, so they started to encourage like homeless ladies or and orphans and beggars. And because no respectable farmer wanted to marry a beggar, they started to call these ladies the the filles de roi, or the daughters of the king. So, and they tried to spruce it up and class it up a little bit by calling them um, basically princesses, but they weren't princesses. They were filles de roi. So these filles de roi would marry the farmers and encourage them to set up families here, and they would get money for each kid that they would have, and they would be strongly encouraged to keep it. So the seniors would be in charge of um, giving them a mill and a church and roads and all of that. And these farmers, which are called habitants or habitants, these habitants are actually what the Canadian hockey team, the Habs, are named after this to this day. Their nickname is the Habitants. Um, but that's basically chapter two. We've talked about women, we've talked about the farmers, we've talked about the seniors and how the seniors were, they would take a profit, they would take a tax in exchange for building the mills and the roads and the schools and the churches for these farmers on their land that everybody could use. They would, and if the senior wasn't doing the job, then the intendant or the governor would replace that senior. It was not good enough. So the Jesuits are a group of people that came together, or sorry, a group of religious people that came over to try to convince the First Nations to join Christianity. They would arrive in 1825, and the black robes, they would walk in and they would preach and preach and preach about Jesus's life until they could convert these people, and they were hailed as saints back in the day. So that's a quick overview of chapter 2. I hope it helps. Sorry it's so long.